Compliments, jokes, even small comments can feel like attacks. If you live on high emotional alert, this is the psychology behind it. Someone says something offhand, a casual remark, maybe even something kind. And yet, something inside you shifts immediately, quietly, like a door closing in a dark room. You replay it. You analyze it. You wonder what they really meant. It doesn't feel dramatic from the inside. It feels like paying attention. It feels like being careful, like reading the room before the room reads you first. And nobody around you seems to notice. They move on. They laugh. They forget what was said within seconds. But you are still there, still holding it, still turning it over like something fragile you're afraid to drop. People will tell you that you're too sensitive. They'll say you overthink. They'll offer the word emotional like it's a diagnosis, like it explains everything and excuses them from understanding anything. But this is not about being weak. This is not about being difficult. This is not even really about the words that were said. This goes much deeper than that. There is a version of you that the world sees. Someone who functions, who responds, who often seems completely fine from the outside. And then there is the version only you experience, the one quietly carrying the weight of every interaction long after it ends. That gap between how you appear and how you actually feel is one of the loneliest spaces a person can live in. You look fine. You sound fine. But inside, something is always slightly braced. It's not that you want to feel this way. You don't choose to replay a conversation at 2 in the morning. You don't choose to feel a sting from something someone said while laughing. It just happens almost before you can stop it. That's the first thing worth understanding. This isn't a character flaw. It isn't a sign that something is broken inside you. It is a sign that your nervous system learned something early, something important, something it still believes is true. Your nervous system is not dramatic. It is efficient. It does exactly what it was trained to do. And somewhere along the way, it was trained to treat social signals as potential threats. When you were younger, maybe words carried weight they shouldn't have. Maybe a tone of voice meant something was coming. Maybe silence meant danger and laughter sometimes preceded pain. The nervous system doesn't forget those lessons. It archives them. It builds a pattern. And then it applies that pattern to every future interaction, whether or not the danger is actually present. So now, when someone makes an offhand comment, your system doesn't hear a comment. It hears a signal. It scans it. It checks for hidden meaning, for underlying tone, for what might be coming next. This is not sensitivity as a personality trait. This is sensitivity as a survival response. There is a profound difference between the two, and that difference changes everything about how you understand yourself. At first, this response protected you. It kept you alert. It helped you read people quickly, to detect shifts in mood before they became something harder to navigate. You became perceptive in ways others weren't. You noticed things, small things, a pause that lasted a second too long, a smile that didn't quite reach someone's eyes, a sentence that ended in a way that felt unfinished. Eventually, that perceptiveness became part of how you moved through the world. You led with it. You used it to stay safe, to stay prepared, to never be caught off guard by someone else's emotions again. But the cost was invisible for a long time, because the same system that kept you safe also made it hard to receive things neutrally. Compliments started to feel suspicious. Jokes started to land with an edge. Even silence started to feel like a statement. You began interpreting not just what people said, but what you feared they meant. And somewhere in that space between what was said and what you heard, a quiet exhaustion started to build. That exhaustion is real. It's not imagined. It's the weight of processing every interaction at a depth most people never reach. It accumulates slowly, invisibly, until it feels like your default state. And the painful irony is this. The very system that was built to protect you from being hurt is often the same system making you feel hurt more frequently. It casts a wider net than it needs to. Think about what that actually looks like in daily life. A friend takes hours to reply to your message. Something inside you already starts constructing reasons. Already starts wondering what you did. A colleague gives feedback in a meeting. Something neutral, something professional. But your chest tightens slightly. Your mind starts reviewing everything you've done recently, searching for what you missed. Someone doesn't smile back the way you expected. And for a moment, just a moment, the world feels slightly less safe than it did a second before. All of this happening beneath the surface, quietly, constantly. This is what living on high emotional alert actually feels like. Not loud. Not dramatic, Just a continuous low-level hum of interpretation, scanning, adjusting, and bracing for impact that never quite comes. And yet, even knowing this, it's hard to stop. Because the system doesn't respond to logic. You can tell yourself they didn't mean it that way, and still feel it. You can intellectually understand that a comment was harmless and still carry it for days. That's because the part of your brain managing this response is not the thinking part. It's older than that. It's faster than that. It responds before your conscious mind even has a chance to intervene. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, fires first. It sends the signal. The feeling arrives. And only after that does your thinking brain try to make sense of what just happened. By then, the emotional experience is already underway. The story is already forming. And the more you try to think your way out of it, the more tangled it can become. This is why being told to just not take it personally feels almost insulting. Not because the advice is cruel, but because it assumes the process is conscious. It assumes you chose to interpret it that way. You didn't choose it. It chose you, or rather, it was chosen for you by experiences that taught your nervous system what to watch for and what to fear in the behavior of others. There is another layer here that rarely gets spoken about. People who take things personally are often people who feel things on behalf of others just as deeply as they feel things for themselves. You don't just feel your own pain acutely. You feel the room. You feel the unspoken tension between two people across a table. You absorb emotional atmosphere the way others absorb sound. This means that when something feels off, you're not only reacting to what was directed at you. You're often reacting to everything that's floating in the emotional environment around you at that moment. You might feel the weight of someone else's bad day and interpret it as something you caused. You might sense distant coldness and immediately search yourself for what you did wrong. This is emotional absorption. And it's one of the quieter, lesser-known dimensions of what people call taking things personally. It's not self-centeredness. It's actually the opposite. It's an overextension of empathy, a nervous system so attuned to the emotional states of others that the boundary between their experience and yours becomes genuinely difficult to locate. You start asking questions like, did I do something wrong? When the more accurate question might be, am I carrying something that was never mine to carry? That distinction is not small. That distinction is, in many ways, everything. Because the moment you begin to separate what belongs to you from what belongs to others, something starts to slowly shift. But that shift doesn't come easily, and it doesn't come all at once. Because there is a deeper layer still, one that sits beneath the nervous system, beneath the empathy, beneath the scanning and the replaying. It is the question of identity. Specifically, the way your sense of self has become quietly dependent on how others respond to you. Not consciously, not by choice, but over time through repetition. When someone's reaction becomes the mirror through which you see yourself, every reflection matters enormously. Every expression, every tone, every pause becomes data about who you are and whether you are enough. This is perhaps the most tender part of this entire experience, because underneath all the hypervigilance and the replaying and the exhaustion is something very simple. A person who wants to know they are safe. A person who wants to know they are loved. And there is nothing wrong with that wanting. Nothing weak about it. Nothing shameful about needing to feel safe in the presence of other people. That is one of the most human needs that exists. But when that need was not consistently met early in life, something compensatory develops. The mind begins to seek safety not through trust, but through vigilance. Not through rest, but through readiness. You learned that you could not always rely on the emotional environment around you to be stable. So you built an internal monitoring system instead. You became your own early warning network. And that system, as exhausting as it is, was an act of intelligence. It was a creative solution to an environment that didn't offer you the consistency you needed. It was never weakness. It was adaptation. But adaptations that serve us in one chapter of life don't always serve us in the next. What protected you in a space where you had little control can quietly limit you in spaces where you actually have more. This is the shift that matters. Not from sensitive to numb. Not from feeling to detachment. But from reactive to responsive. From automatic to aware. From surviving the moment to actually inhabiting it. That shift begins not with changing how you feel, but with changing your relationship to how you feel. It starts with a small, quiet pause between the trigger and the story you build around it. Because here is what happens in that unguarded moment after someone says something that lands wrong. A feeling arrives first. Fast, physical, real. And then, almost instantly, a narrative follows. The narrative is where the suffering lives. Not in the feeling itself, but in the story. They don't respect me. I always say the wrong thing. People don't actually like me. I knew this would happen. Those stories feel like facts. They feel like conclusions drawn from evidence. But they are almost always written by the frightened part of you, the part still operating from old data, old environments, old threats. Learning to notice that gap between the feeling and the story is one of the most quietly revolutionary things a person in this experience can do. It requires no performance, no forced positivity. It simply requires a moment of honest curiosity. Is this story true? Or is this the version my nervous system defaulted to because it matches a pattern it already knows? That question doesn't erase the feeling. It doesn't dismiss it. But it creates just enough space to prevent the feeling from automatically becoming a conclusion about your worth or your relationships. And sometimes that space is all you need. Not a breakthrough. Not a transformation. Just a breath between the arrow landing and the meaning you assign to where it came from. There will still be days when someone's words settle into you in ways you can't immediately explain. Days when a comment follows you home, sits with you through dinner, visits you before sleep. On those days, instead of fighting it or shaming yourself for it, try something different. Try asking what the feeling is actually pointing to. Not what they did wrong. Not what you did wrong. But what part of you feels suddenly unseen or unsteady. Because more often than not, what feels like a reaction to what someone said is actually a signal about something inside you that is asking for attention. A wound that hasn't fully healed. A need that hasn't been voiced. Other people's words become unbearable triggers mainly when they land on something already tender. When the ground beneath them is solid, the same words simply pass through without taking root. So the real work, the slow and unglamorous and deeply worthwhile work, is not about becoming less sensitive. It is about building more internal ground. More places inside yourself that feel stable regardless of what is reflected back. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent to others. Your sensitivity is not the problem. Misdirected, unanchored sensitivity is what creates the suffering. Rooted, self-aware sensitivity is actually one of the most powerful ways of moving through the world. The people who feel deeply, who notice everything, who carry the emotional texture of a room in their chest, those people are not burdens. They are often the most present people in any space they enter. They are the ones who remember how you said something, not just what you said. They are the ones who notice when you're not quite yourself before you found the words for it. That quality is rare. And it deserves to be treated as such, not suppressed, not apologized for, but understood, directed, and gently protected from the environments and the inner stories that turn it against you. You are not too much. You have simply been carrying more than most people realize for longer than anyone has acknowledged, with less support than you deserved. And perhaps the most important thing is this. The version of you that learned to scan every room, to read every face, to brace for impact in ordinary moments, that version kept you here. It did its job. But you are allowed to slowly, carefully, teach yourself a different way of being safe. Not through vigilance. Not through anticipating pain. But through knowing, quietly and without needing proof, that you are still whole even when someone's words suggest otherwise. That knowing is not built overnight. It is built in small moments of choosing your own interpretation over your nervous system's automatic one. It is built in the practice of returning to yourself after being pulled outward. It is built every time you catch the story forming and ask gently whether it is actually true. Every time you let a moment pass without turning it into evidence against yourself. These are not dramatic acts. They don't look like anything from the outside. But internally they represent a profound shift in loyalty. A slow turning toward yourself instead of away. Because for a long time, the instinct has been to look outward for information about your value. To read faces and tones and pauses and silences for clues about whether you are acceptable, whether you are loved. And that outward searching is exhausting in a way that's almost impossible to explain to someone who has never experienced it. It is like trying to fill something from the outside that can only be filled from within. Not because other people don't matter. They do. Connection matters. Being loved matters. Being seen by others is one of the genuine needs of a human life. That part is real. But there is a difference between receiving love and requiring constant external confirmation to feel safe enough to exist. One is nourishment. The other is a kind of endless hunger that no amount of reassurance can permanently satisfy. The reassurance helps for a moment. Someone says something kind and the system quiets. But then the silence returns. And the scanning starts again. and the next interaction becomes the new test. This cycle is not a moral failing. It is a predictable outcome of a nervous system that never fully learned to self-soothe, that never had the consistent mirroring it needed to develop a stable inner sense of self. So instead of judging the cycle, it helps to understand it with the same compassion you would offer a child who is afraid of the dark. The fear is real to them. The dark itself may be harmless, but the fear still needs acknowledgement before it can soften. Your emotional responses deserve that same acknowledgement. Not indulgence, not performance, but quiet recognition. A moment of saying, I feel this. I understand why I feel this. And I can choose what I do next. That three-part movement, feeling, understanding, choosing, is the foundation of something that slowly replaces hypervigilance over time. It is not a cure. It is a practice. It is done again and again in ordinary moments. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, the gap between trigger and story begins to widen. The automatic narratives begin to lose some of their authority. The old patterns still arise, but they no longer feel like the only possible truth. You begin to notice that you can feel hurt and still not be destroyed by it. You can receive a careless comment and examine it before absorbing it. You can sit with discomfort without immediately needing to resolve it into a conclusion. This is emotional maturity, not in the sense of feeling less, but in the sense of being able to hold more without being swept away by it. It is depth without drowning, sensitivity without surrender. And something else begins to happen too. As you slowly stop outsourcing your sense of worth to the reactions of others, your relationships begin to change in quality. They become less fraught. You start to hear what people actually say rather than what you feared they meant. You begin to experience conversations as exchanges rather than evaluations. Presence replaces performance, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. The people in your life may not even notice the shift at first, but you will. In the way a walk home after a difficult conversation feels lighter than it used to. In the way a silence no longer needs to be filled with interpretation. In the way you can receive a compliment and let it land, actually land, without immediately looking for the catch or deflecting it before it reaches you. These are small moments. They don't announce themselves. But they are the real evidence of change, not the absence of sensitivity, but the presence of something steadier underneath it. There is a kind of peace available to people like you that is different from the peace others might find. It is not the peace of not feeling. It is the peace of finally understanding what you feel and why. It is the peace of knowing that your inner world, complex and layered and sometimes overwhelming as it is not something to be ashamed of. It is something to be gradually, patiently inhabited. You were not born too sensitive for this world. You were born fully feeling into a world that often doesn't know what to do with that. And so you learn to doubt the very thing that makes you most alive. But sensitivity, held with awareness and rooted in self-trust, is not a vulnerability. It is a form of intelligence. It is a way of knowing the world that goes beyond words and surfaces and easily legible signals. The world needs people who feel things deeply, who notice what others miss, who carry the emotional truth of a room without being asked to. That has always been a gift, even when it was treated as a burden. So perhaps the invitation here is not to become someone who takes things less personally. Perhaps it is to become someone who knows themselves so well, so honestly and so gently, that other people's words lose their power to define you. Not because you stop caring, but because you finally care enough about yourself to stop handing the pen to everyone else and letting them write your story. You are allowed to be the one who decides what something means. You are allowed to pause before accepting an interpretation that diminishes you. You are allowed to be, quietly and without apology, on your own side. If something in this felt familiar, sit with it. Not to analyze it further, but simply to let yourself be understood. Because understanding, real understanding, is where everything begins to slowly change. And if this kind of quiet psychological exploration speaks to something in you, there is more here. More conversations like this one waiting for you whenever you are ready.